We will begin by allowing each candidate to 1.5 minutes to introduce yourself, tell us why you're running and your qualifications for the position, and only because you're sitting on the left, I'll start with Mr. Farnsworth.
Okay, I'm Rob Farnsworth, and I'm asking for your vote on November 8th. I grew up in Chisholm, graduated from Chisholm High School. I attended college at the University of St. Thomas, where I earned my degree in history and social studies. About 6 years after that, I earned my master's degree from Minnesota State Mankato in special education. So I've been a teacher for roughly 15 years. I'm currently teaching special education. I work in the special education department with the Hibbing School District. I live in Hibbing with my wife Jamie and with our 4 children. And this is going to sound cliche, but my children are the reason that I'm running for this. My wife is a nurse, I'm a special ed teacher, and so we don't have a huge difficulty finding work. I want my children to have an opportunity to stay on the range and to be able to find work. And with the Metro DFL attacking mining, attacking our way of life on the Iron Range, I'm not sure that my kids are going to be able to stay here and raise their family here if that's what they want to do. So that's why I'm running for this seat. I have experience both in the public and private sector. I'm also a licensed real estate salesperson. In addition to being a teacher, I've helped run my family's small business, and so I believe I have the qualifications necessary as representative for District 6A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julie Sandstede.
Well, again, thank you for hosting this forum. I am Julie Sandstede. I was born and raised in Hibbing, where I currently live now. My husband Evan and I are raising our 3 children as well. I am a 22-year teacher. I earned my degree in music education, and then after that I went on and earned my master's degree in curriculum and instruction. Currently I work for the Virginia School District. I've worked with them for the last 20 years. The reason that I have decided to run is because I'm very passionate about the area that I grew up in. We have always had a very strong history of good paying jobs, a strong labor force, and in my lifetime that is starting to change. I want to make sure too that my children have an opportunity to return to the range if that's where they want to earn a living and raise their families, and I want there to be a rich opportunity for them to exist and participate in their communities like I had. So I believe that with my history as a teacher, working with diverse groups of people, as a labor leader, as a negotiator, I believe I have the skills that it's going to take to get down to St. Paul and work across the table with one another to start focusing on the issues and getting jobs for our area and things accomplished.
This year's legislative session ended without a bonding bill, without transportation funding, without an increase in local government aid, and with other failings. What needed to be done differently? How can we get past politics to serve all Minnesotans?
Ms. Sandstede, we'll start with you.
So I think first of all, the biggest thing is bills can't be coming across the table less than 24 hours before we need to vote on them. I think those bills need to be in the hands of the voters or in the hands of the legislators 48 hours out or longer. That would help, so we don't have big issues taking place at the last minute. And there were errors in a lot of those things, and that's part of the reason they didn't pass. I think too, there was too much waiting till the last minute, too much gridlock, and I think that needs to change. So as I said before, we need to be working on the issues sooner and working together across the table to address the issues.
Mr. Farnsworth?
I believe that the most important thing that we need to do to get some of this important legislation passed is just learn how to work together. I've been a union member for 17 years. I was local union president when I was teaching with the Department of Corrections for 2 years, which makes me a bit of an oddity, being a Republican and being pro-union. But what I've learned through that process is that it is possible to work with people across the aisle, and we seem to have a situation in St. Paul where they're unwilling to work together. One side tries to insert something in a bill, another side tries to insert something in the bill, and it's just not working. We need a transportation bill. Greater Minnesota needs better roads and bridges. We don't need more trains in the Twin Cities. We need to focus on what actually all of Minnesota needs, which are roads and bridges. We needed that tax cut to be passed. It was $900 million, and it didn't get passed because of one word. And they needed to talk about this to make sure that it could get passed, and they just need to work together. Quite frankly, they sort of need to grow up.
Thank you, Ms. Sandstede. Any
Good.
thoughts? Very good. Our next question will be asked by Vern, and Mr. Farnsworth, you can answer first, please.
One of the failings this year, and for the past several years, has been the lack of long-range funding plan for transportation. How do you support paying for ongoing bridge and highway maintenance, an increase in gas tax, a miles driven tax, cutting other things from the state budget, or another strategy? What would you do?
That's a good question because every person in Minnesota is impacted by our roads and bridges, and so we need to make sure that our roads and bridges are the best in the world. And I'll say this from the start, I do not support increasing the gas tax because it is going to harm lower and middle income people much more than it'll harm upper income people. And so I don't support the gas tax. With a $41 billion budget that we have in Minnesota, it seems to me that we could carve that $500 million somewhere in the budget to pay for that. Another area that we could look at is, hey, let's not spend $1.9 billion on a train in the Twin Cities that maybe 0.5% of the population will use, and it'll cost $25 to $30 million per year to maintain. Instead, we could use those funds for roads and bridges that benefit everyone in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sandstede.
Could you read the question one more time?
Again. One of the failings this year and for the past several years has been the lack of a long-range funding plan for transportation. How do you support paying for ongoing bridge and highway maintenance, an increase in the gas tax, a miles driven tax, cutting other things from the state budget? What would you do?
Okay, so my first thought on this is something I had spoken to before. I think when it comes to things like roads and bridges, that can't just be a bonding type of funding plan. I think we need to be looking at a permanently indexed or earmarked type of a plan. And then we need to account for that moving forward, to account for inflation. I think it needs to be in the budget like any other type of item you would budget. Even in a home family budget, you have definite categories, and I think it needs to be in there. As far as how do we get there, we have a surplus right now. I would support using some of the surplus to address those needs. I do support some type of a tax, whether it's a gas tax. I would keep my options open on what that would be, though.
Thank you both very much. Anything else?
Yeah, I would like to say that we do have, a lot of people confuse the general fund budget with the total budget, and we do have money that is earmarked, that is set aside from the current gas tax, from car registration fees that goes for transportation. That's not enough. You know, we need to add, I think everything that people buy in Minnesota that relates to an automobile, be it tires, be it getting their oil changed or getting an air freshener, those taxes need to be earmarked specifically for transportation, in addition to taking some of the $41 billion from the general fund.
Thank you. Ms. Sandstede, that's good. Okay, moving on. Chris?
Like transportation, rural broadband is a priority lawmakers seem to love to support. Yet year after year, funding for rural broadband is inadequate. How big a priority is it to you and why?
We need jobs. We need jobs in this area, and we're not going to be drawing in industry, small companies, corporations, unless we have the broadband available to them. So it has to be a legislative priority.
Thank you. Mr. Burns?
Rural broadband is extremely important. During the Great Depression, one of the programs that was passed was to try and get electricity to a lot of rural areas, and I think that rural broadband has become what electricity was in the 1930s. I'm not a last miler. I wouldn't say that we need to spend $1 million so that somebody at the end of a 2-mile dirt road should have rural broadband. We need to look at some other sorts of options, whether it be satellite internet, but we do need to make this a priority. One of the things that I've talked about is the Connect America plan. The federal government has already allocated funds for our area, for our district, to provide rural broadband. And so one of the things that our state needs to do is make sure that we're not overlapping. We're not trying to spend money to provide rural broadband in areas that the federal government has already allocated money. But it absolutely should be something that should be a priority in our state.
Very good. Class?
Another major responsibility of state government is education and education funding. How can education be improved in Minnesota, including closing the achievement gap? What measures would you push?
Mr. Farnsworth, we'll start with you this time.
I don't think a minute is going to be enough for this.
That's okay, if we can go a little bit over, that's fine. We'll be fair to both of you though.
Okay. I'm a teacher and I'm passionate about education. And I think over the last 40 years, the biggest mistake that we've made is this transition to telling every single kid in our schools that they need to go to a four-year college and university. We are failing our kids when we have stripped our high schools of the technical trades. My vision for our schools is that they could partner with our colleges, with our technical schools, so that kids can get technical programs in high school. Maybe they can get a welding certificate. They could walk out of high school with zero student debt, and if they wanted to just get a job, they could get a job. That would help alleviate our student loan crisis. And the reality is, for a lot of kids, I'm in special education, a lot of the kids that I work with probably aren't going to go to college, and that's okay. Mike Rowe from Dirty Job talks about it all the time. My plumber makes more money than I do, and that's a good thing. So why can't we have apprenticeship programs for kids that I work with in special education so they can walk out and maybe become a plumber or an electrician with zero student loan, and we don't have to tell every single student to go to a four-year college and university. For those kids that will go to a four-year college or university, absolutely, we need to do a better job of preparing them. But we need to prepare kids to do what they're actually going to do, not just say all of them should be ready to go to college or university.
Thank you.
Would you read it one more time just so I hear all the pieces of the question?
Another major responsibility of state government is education and education funding. How can education be improved in Minnesota, including the achievement gap? What measures would you push?
So again, when it comes to education, first of all, I would say we really need to refocus and not have such a huge push for standardized testing. Right now, as educators, there's this incredible, intense pressure on teachers to just hit the mark with their students all the time, teaching to the test. That's number one. I think, two, we need to start looking at our clientele coming into the classrooms and acknowledge that the students that we have in our classrooms today are not the same students that we had 20 years ago, 40 years ago. The issues facing our students today are significantly different, and as an educator, we cannot meet them at their need until we can have a very frank and open conversation about that. We need to have full community schools where we are not just helping the students, but we are helping the families as well in assessing their needs and looking at how we can help them, whether it's medical or dental or mental health needs, more school counselors, more social workers, drug counselors in the schools. We need to be looking at those issues. The achievement gap, I think, will be addressed when we can start addressing some of those issues, but I would also agree with what Rob had said. We cannot keep our focus on a four-year college. We need to look at two-year and vocational colleges as well and start realizing a whole life experience for them and not just pushing them into a four-year track.
I realized I missed the achievement gap part of the question. Can I touch on that?
Absolutely, that's what I was going to ask specifically.
Right.
Yes.
The number one predictor for students, well, the number two predictor, the number one predictor is that kids actually show up, which is hard to believe. If you come to school, you'll actually do well. But following that, the number one predictor for educational success is the economic background that you come from. And we hate to admit it, we hate to talk about it in Minnesota, but people of color make less money than people of European descent. So the best thing we can do to address the achievement gap is to address the economic gap so that a single mother makes enough money, maybe walks out of high school with a welding degree and she makes enough money as a welder so that she's not working two jobs and not able to help her students in those communities of color or their children.
I'm good.
Good, very good, thank you. Vern, with our next question, please.
Health insurance costs are skyrocketing and insurance companies are bailing, prompting some to call for dismantling MNsure. Does Minnesota need to start over with this health exchange, move on to the federal exchange, or what when it comes to the Affordable Health Care Act?
Ms. Sandstede?
That's a great question. No, I don't think we need to do away with MNsure or anything like that. I think we're in the process and we need to keep revising and looking at that. The problem with healthcare right now is not, it's the cost that is out of control, and we need to look at how to limit the cost of the services. So there's some kind of a stable ground to go from. Right now, the pools are imbalanced, and there's the high risk and the pools that are, a little more balanced, and then there's individuals who don't belong to a pool, and their costs are excessive if they have one kind of a devastating event, and that's what's driving the cost up. We have to look at leveling it. I personally would propose that looking at a single payer type of a program, I think it would be worth looking into at least doing some kind of a study to see what the best fit for Minnesotans would be, but definitely we need to contain the cost. I know too that we are working hard at like prescription costs and leveling those out. So we are making steps in the right direction, but we do have more work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth.
This will probably be one of the few questions that Ms. Sandstede and I have pretty stark difference. I think that MNsure is an absolute disaster. We've spent over $600 million developing a website that has nothing but glitches and technical problems. This year, the increase in premiums in insurance on the exchanges between 35 and 67. MNsure isn't working. I've never understood why we have MNsure, because the federal government has their own exchange, and then they gave us a bunch of money to create our own exchange. Why, if they're going to force the Affordable Care Act on all of the states, why also force them to have their own exchange that has clearly not worked? And as far as looking at a single-payer system, I would just like to point out that the Veterans Administration is kind of a glaring example of how the single-payer system won't work. So I would say, yes, we need to scrap MNsure, allow people to join the federal exchange, and then we can work out a Minnesota plan, because the reality is before the Affordable Care Act, Minnesota had the highest rate of insurance coverage in the nation. We've barely budged the needle on that, spending tons of money, and so we need to do something drastically different.
Okay.
Good, thank you. Our next question will be asked by Chris Friedkin.
Even after 10 years of scientific and environmental review, some are trying to stop the PolyMet project. In the same way, Twin Metals' plan to mine copper, nickel, and other precious metals has been divisive. Where do you stand on PolyMet, and where do you stand on Twin Metals?
I am 100% in support of PolyMet. They have gone far too long. 10 years, hundreds of millions of dollars is too long. I'm extremely disappointed that the governor got in the way and not only said you're not going to mine, but he said you're not even going to explore it. You're not even going to create an economic or an environmental impact statement. And he went a step further and said you're not going to explore on state line. He also went to the federal government and said, oh, and also please, you don't let them explore on your land. That is absolutely disgusting. And non-ferrous mining is going to open the door to the next 100 years of mining on the Iron Range. I am 100% in support because the science bears it out. The water that's going to come out of those plants will be cleaner than residential drinking water. We can mine cleanly, and we should be allowed to do it. And we shouldn't allow the governor and the DFL environmentalists from the Twin Cities to shut down our way of life.
Ms. Sandstede?
So I absolutely support PolyMet, and the 10-year study is there. I believe in scientific evidence when we're moving forward in mining. In that situation, the science is there. They've passed the environmental studies. I think it's good to go. I think they should be allowed to move forward. I support the Twin Metals as well as far as the investigation. Again, they were looking to drill and take soil samples and different things like that. I don't see the harm in that. I think that should move forward. And again, I think the science should be allowed to play out. If there is issues that arise, mining situation, then we need to step back and take a look at it. But right now, again, I don't think there's a problem with getting the samples and moving forward. I don't pretend to understand why the governor decided to say no more. I do think it was to maybe satisfy other outside interest groups. And I don't support that. I think we are safe doing that, and I support that. And in that, there's also spin-off jobs that are going to come with PolyMet, and that's an absolute positive for our area.
Thank you very much. Sounds like you're both on the same page. So move on. Klasky.
Alrighty. Last winter, the legislature played politics instead of helping laid-off miners and others out of work on the Iron Range. With measures to curb steel dumping now in place, and with the steel industry now seemingly rebounding, what does the Minnesota legislator still need to be doing to bolster the economy in northeastern Minnesota?
Ms. Sandstede?
Well, first of all, we need to ensure that our opportunity to continue mining and doing what we know well is allowed, and that we can keep moving forward. We need to support like the SR projects. and getting them under ownership and to where they can get back to work and start working. We also need to pay our debts to the people that are invested in that. So we need to get that going. With the mining, we need to continue to work with our federal government to ensure that we don't have the problem that we have already occurred, or that has already occurred with the excess dumping. We need to look towards the new type of a pellet to compete on a world or a global market. So that's something that I think we will evolve into, but we need to be looking forward to doing that and just keep moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth.
Can you repeat the last part of the question?
With measures to curb steel dumping now in place, and with the steel industry now seemingly rebounding, what does the Minnesota legislator still need to be doing to bolster the economy in northeastern Minnesota?
So of course the economy in northeastern Minnesota is worse off than the rest of the state. The rest of the state is about 3.9% unemployment. St. Louis County, Itasca County are around 10%. The first thing that we need to do three things with mining so that our mines can be competitive. We need to roll back some of the environmental regulations that have caused an increase in electricity. Energy costs for our mines take up about 40% of their costs. And with these misguided energy policies in Minnesota, we've caused a burden on our mines. So we need to look at electricity. We need to look at land. The state of Minnesota owns approximately 17% of the land in the whole state. We need to make sure that land is being opened up for our mines so that they're able to get the materials out of the ground cheaply and efficiently. And we need to look at the permitting process, particularly the length that it takes, even for existing taconite mines, to begin mining new areas. And then as far as economic development, we need to use the IRRB, use our amazing college system, and start developing some programs and providing incentives to entrepreneurs in areas that we haven't seen before, such as computer programming or cybersecurity.
Sounds good, good, thank you. Finally, our last question, Vern.
I just did the last question, but I'll do this one. We touched on a lot of issues here today. What do you think are the biggest issues facing the Minnesota legislature? What are your priorities and how do you plan to tackle them?
Mr. Farnsworth.
I think there are three issues that are the three biggest. The first one is the economy and job growth, and trying to get job growth to be more even. As I mentioned, we have a significantly higher unemployment rate on the Iron Range into Itasca County than the rest of the state, and we need to make sure that we can grow those jobs so that everybody that wants a job can have a job. We also need to, the second one is education. As I mentioned, we need to reform education so that kids get the education and they get the training that they will actually use after high school, and that'll help to mitigate some of the student loan crisis. And the third thing that we need to focus on in the state is transportation. And again, I am not in favor of spending $1.9 billion on the Southwest Light Rail that will take approximately 2 to 3% of the cars in that corridor off the road. And I'm not even saying 2 to 3% of the cars in the state, just in that corridor, and will cost somewhere between 25 and 30 million. We need to focus on transportation in the whole state that everybody can use. Those are the three priorities that I would focus on.
Very good. Ms. Sandstede?
Again, if you would read the question.
We touched on a lot of issues here today. What do you think are the biggest issues facing the Minnesota legislature? What are your priorities and how do you plan to tackle them?
I think some of the biggest issues facing the legislature right now is the gridlock that's going on. I also think that there's concern about transparency with legislators, and I would address those personally by being accessible to all of my constituents, and then two, by working across the table. As far as the priorities go, I think the legislative priorities would be the economy, definitely our jobs, infrastructure, our sewers, our bridges, and again, I think we have a surplus that we can start using to start dealing with those biggest issues, or the biggest issues, the areas needing addressing. And I would definitely continue to focus on our education. because it's not just the K-12 education, it's higher education too right now that needs a whole lot of support to get our students into those careers.
Very much. And I thank you both again for participating in this News Tribune Forum for House District 6A, Republican Rob Farnsworth and DFL Julie Sandstede. I thank those watching at DuluthNewsTribune.com, those here in attendance today. We'll wrap up by wishing both of you the best of luck on November 8th, and also by allowing you 1.5 minutes to kind of sum up why a voter should vote for you. And Ms. Sandstede, we'll start with you.
Okay, again, Julie Sandstede, I'm asking for your vote November 8th. Because I think it's important to have a woman down in St. Paul. Carly did great work for us, and I think it's nice to have that gender balance. So I think that's an important aspect. I also think that I bring to the table a perspective of, as a teacher, having worked with lots of different families and personalities and socioeconomic backgrounds, as a strong union leader, I understand what it takes to work across the table in negotiations to get jobs done. I understand that we're going to have issues that we're not probably going to be able to resolve the first time around, but I think we can get something done each time, and I'm committed to doing that. I am passionate about our children. I'm passionate about education. I'm passionate about our communities. I know the Iron Range. This is where I was born and raised. And I believe that my children, your children, the children of our future deserve the same opportunities or more that I have. I don't think that we need to fold up and call it good. I think it's time to evolve and move forward, and I think I have the strengths to help us do that. And I'm asking for your vote November 8th.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farnsworth.
Well, again, I would like to thank the Duluth News Tribune Editorial Board for hosting this event. And I'm going to share something that Julie has actually heard me say before. In 1932, when President Roosevelt was running for president, one of the campaign slogans or phrases that he said, when speaking to African American voters, he said that it's time to turn the picture of Lincoln to the wall and vote for Roosevelt. And the reason he said that is that at that time, 95% of African American voters voted for Republicans. And he was making the case that Republicans no longer represented African Americans. I'd like to make the case, and I believe it's a compelling case, that it's time for Iron Rangers to turn the picture of Roosevelt to the wall, because the DFL that most Iron Rangers are voting for hasn't existed for 20 years. The DFL in the Twin Cities that has taken over the DFL in Minnesota wants to end mining. At their convention, and then again at their executive board committee in the Twin Cities, they tried to pass an anti-mining resolution that I believe will be passed in November because they just pushed it down. This is not a group that is in favor of mining. They held up a good transportation bill because they wanted to spend $1.9 billion on a train in the Twin Cities. So I'm asking voters on the Iron Range, across the Iron Range from Kinney all the way over to Marble, to turn the picture of Roosevelt to the wall, because I believe that I will better represent your views in St. Paul, and I'll better represent Iron Rangers to keep the economy moving and to make sure that we have good roads and good schools. Thank you.
Thank you both very much.